let's get started. I know it's right after lunch, so it's both tiring and people will come in late. I also realized that there's lots of people here not from Minnesota or Minneapolis, and they don't know what MinnPost is. So we might have lost some people on that one. Anyway, MinnPost is a news organization for Minnesota. It's a small nonprofit online newspaper. And I'm going to talk about how and why we build the things we do. And more of the practical side. There won't be really any code. There's going to be some non-JavaScript talk, but it'll be fun. My name is Palazzolo. I'm the interactive news developer at MinnPost. Overall, MinnPost is about 30 people, plus some freelance writers and other contract people. And then we have a small data team that works with data and the reporters to make interactive and visual things. And our team is me and about two other half people. So I'm the programmer, and then Katie does some of the managing and design stuff, and then Tom does some data analysis, and he does some programming as well. So what do we do over there? It's mostly data-driven, interactive, visual stuff. We're not working on the content management side of the news. We're working on actually making the news. Sort of what I'd like to think, we tell the stories with some pretty pictures. Hopefully it's more than just pretty, and they're actually informative. But it's visual narration, essentially, most of the time. So just to go through some of the stuff that we build, just so you have more context. So this was actually just the other day. We had primaries across Minnesota, and so we built an API on the Minnesota Secretary of State data, and then created this interface that just updated live every couple minutes, so someone could come and just keep a look on the page. And you can search all the races that were going on, but these are the ones that were sort of more important. And the primaries themselves are not too exciting, anyway.
They're all candidates and voters.
Yeah. This was a couple weeks ago that we had a new light rail come into town from St. Paul to Minneapolis, and so this is a look at like the census data for that area. This is built with D3, and you can go through sort of the different census areas and see visually how that's made up. This is more of like a sort of questionnaire approach where you can interactively go through some questions and figure out which candidate probably best represents you. And we've done that a few times with different things. This is just a straight up map that was much more heavier on the data processing side than it is on the interface side. But this is mapping every single parcel in 4-county area, in the metro area. Millions of parcels, I don't actually know how many. Specifically, we're looking at the residential ones to sort of see areas of income, essentially. This is a look at temperature. In the past week is the top one, past 30 days, and then when I took this, it was the winter. But we have cold winters and sometimes even colder winters. And so this actually updates every hour to look at the current temperature and then put it in context of the 30-year normal. And so you can start to see how different is our weather. We also, for those that live in the Midwest and specifically Minnesota, it gets cold and snows a lot. And where you can park your car when it snows a lot is a pretty important thing. So we loaded up all the routes for the snow emergency into CartoDB and created this interface where people can see where to park and where not to park on days where a snow emergency is called. And then we also just sort of embed random charts into more narrative pieces or more copy-heavy pieces. So we have that job as well. And occasionally we've done sort of artistic pieces, which you can't really see too much of this. But as part of Northern Spark, which is a big art festival that happens over the summer. We visualized 13,000 lakes over an 8-hour period. And it really had no news value whatsoever, but it was fun. So, what kind of defines why we do the things we do and how we do the things to do? And this is probably where things are going to differ. You know, like we make our decisions based on these constraints. They aren't always the best, and they're not going to be perfect for everyone else. But this is kind of what defines us. So, the CMS, the content management system. This is what manages all our stories. We publish up to 10 stories a day, and you know, it holds all of it. Goes back as far as we've existed, which is about 8 years. And so this is a really important part of the website. In fact, defines the website from a technical standpoint. And there's been a lot of talk about sort of anti-CMS, and it kind of comes from people that have used CMSs and have realized that they're annoying. We use Drupal, which is PHP-based CMS, but a lot of news organizations either have their own or a lot of them use WordPress. And they have their pluses and minuses. But most of them aren't geared towards making interactive parts. And so what we do is, well, I'll just describe what we do because of it later. But it defines a lot about how we build things. We also need it to last forever. Essentially, you know, as a news organization, people need to go back and see what we did, even though, you know, the thing we wrote a year ago, maybe 2 people go to a day, it still needs to be there. It needs to be in some working order. And this drives a lot of it, too. We have a short build time. We have deadlines. We don't do breaking news at our news organization, so we're not daily deadlines, but we do need to be relevant, and so that's usually a couple weeks is our average build time. It can be a week. It could be a day. It could be a couple months. Most of our projects don't go any longer than that. And essentially, most news pieces really high initial traffic, and then it just kind of dies off. Our sort of interactive pieces usually have a bigger tail than most of the written pieces, but so we need it to work, but we don't need it to, you know, we don't need to add features later on. And we do have to sort of support IE8. This means we have to have a fallback if we're using like D3, or we need it to at least work, maybe not look exactly the same across the browsers. But we have I want to say almost 8% of our audience is on IE8, which is sad but true. So we got to deal with it. And we have no money. We are a nonprofit, a small nonprofit. We have some advertising, we have foundation support, and we have like member support. But we essentially have no money. So anything, especially say a monthly cost, which is essential, an infinite cost, is a big decision. So we try to avoid those at all costs. So with those constraints, what do we do? So everything is front end. It makes a lot more sense for us to put as much processing on the people that come to our site than it is for us to do it ourselves. It saves us money, and it's sort of easier to maintain. So, like I said, we use Drupal. Drupal allows us to embed things and still maintain some level of permission so that only I can embed things while someone else who has no idea what some JavaScript would do can't do it. So some news organizations work outside their CMS. So they create maybe a subdomain like apps.newyorktimes.com, which is not true, and then put their apps there, which is outside the CMS. But then you have to maintain different templates. It's harder to sort of organize your content all together in a single place. So what I started doing a couple years ago was just embedding everything, like all the HTML, all the CSS, all the JavaScript, and not linking it, but actually putting it into the page. And with some of the libraries that we use, we would host on S3 and just link to those. But essentially, it was just writing straight up, not minimizing, not anything, just putting it into the page. It worked, but it was not easy to maintain. So one day after, sort of looking at things, I kind of fought the idea of a compile step, and so I really didn't want to use anything that required that. But CSS is kind of annoying. And not that it's not awesome, but it's kind of verbose, and Sass gets rid of that verbosity a lot. We can use some nesting stylings and variables. So I was like, well, I'm gonna start using this. Something to learn, something to try out. But it introduced this idea of compiling. So Sass is a CSS preprocessor. Is that right? Yeah. So it's sort of a nicer syntax to CSS, and then it compiles to CSS. But you have to compile. And you can't run without some extra libraries. You can't run Sass natively in the browser, and so you've got to compile and then load up your changes in the browser. Probably many people already know that, but so you're already running the step as you develop, and so this introduces this build process, this building tool called Grunt, which you can run to build your Sass. And you can have it watch your files, so when they change, it automatically builds those things for you, right? So now I'm compiling Sass, and I've got this tool to help me run these tasks and see when changes are happening. So why not pile on a whole bunch of other stuff, right? So JSLint, it sort of looks at your JavaScript to make sure it's coded correctly or coded to a certain standard. So this is done and every save a file. Really helpful, really ensures that you've got some good code. It's not going to fix all bugs, but it's just going to make sure that your code is standardized. And to save some space and some HTTP requests, we want to combine all our JavaScript files into one so that it's only sent to the client once, so we can connect that all within a Grunt task. For our templates, our front-end templates, we can compile those up front and put them into our concatenated file. And then we can crunch it all into some ugly JavaScript that's actually smaller, and it's cheaper to go across the wire. And since we're already there, we might as well run an HTTP server since all our code is just front-end there, and it's much easier to tell someone to just run a Grunt task after installing the dependencies than it is to, say, install an HTTP server through Python or Apache or some other way to run your server when you already have these really simple tools to do development really quick. So with all that, we have, instead of just raw JavaScript in the page, we've got this like compiled piece of JavaScript and CSS and stuff. So what we end up doing is just deploying to S3. We deploy the JavaScript file and the CSS file, and then we just use a little bit of HTML code to sort of embed it all into our pages. So it's just a minimal amount of HTML. Ideally, it'd be actually just a couple lines of HTML, but there's a couple caveats that we run into. One, if for IE8, we want to tell the user that they kind of suck, and it may not be their fault. So we have a little bit of IE8 specific code, HTML code that says, hey, your browser might not work, and here's how to deal with it. And then there's a little bit of Java or no script code. So if someone doesn't have JavaScript enabled, which is almost nearly impossible these days, it tells them that you've got to do that. So we end up with a little more than just a couple lines. So now that we sort of have this process of putting everything together, we want to manage dependencies of our front-end assets. So we use RequireJS, and Almond is a lightweight version of RequireJS for builds. It's essentially RequireJS. And the main reason we use it is because it works without a compile step. You can include your files on the page. And it supports shims more easily than other things. And there's lots of libraries that aren't built for AMD or Browserify or anything. And we use lots of different stuff. So it makes a lot more sense for us to use Require. But honestly, I'm not going to fight anyone on the idea of using something else. There's definitely reasons for it otherwise. We also use Bower. Bower is something to sort of just download libraries, assets, front-end assets. It could be JavaScript, it could be CSS, it could be HTML stuff, even though you can't actually include that. But Bower is a really lightweight way to manage those dependencies and where they come from. And it's not perfect, but it's much better than others, any other option. So we also, Bower does, it's got a way of telling the application, like, what are the files that you want to include. But unfortunately, there's like, some libraries have a million different ways of what you want to include. Some have legacy support, some don't. Sometimes you just want the JavaScript and not the CSS. So what we end up doing is put a little sort of map of files that we want into the bower.json. And then we create a little extra bit of process through our Grunt task and some of our front-end stuff to say, all right, pull in these when we need it. That way, we don't actually have to manually manage. You know, if we want leaflet, well, we want the leaflet.js. We actually want the source of leaflet.js and the CSS. So that's just a little extra. So what libraries do we actually use when building on the things we do? First off, it's got to be lightweight. We got to, these are, we got to build quick, and we have to make it fast, of course. So the only thing that we almost always include is underscore and jQuery. And jQuery it's kind of iffy depending on what we actually need to do. jQuery is DOM manipulation. Underscore is just some helpful, mostly array collection functions for JavaScript. And these are the only things that I would say is an actual dependency for our work, for everything. For Backbone, or for data-heavy stuff, if we're connecting to an API, or just have a lot of data, we use Backbone, which adds on as a model view controller sort of thing. We don't use the view part really, but it adds on the ability to have events and manage collections and stuff for your data. It's really helpful, pretty lightweight. And we use this thing called Ractive, which is relatively new, and it's essentially a DOM manipulation library, but it's a two-way binding connection from data to the view to the DOM, and it's just the view part, the DOM creation part, and it's pretty slick. I mean, it works sort of like the DOM part of Angular or Ember sort of works, but it's just that front end or just that DOM view part, and it works perfectly for us. One, because it's awesome, and two, because we have this backbone, we have this data side, we can pull out Ractive if we need to, we can put it in if we need to, because sometimes our interface isn't really going to change that much, we just need to create some DOM elements and stuff like that, and so we don't always need it. If anyone's dealt with dates and times and has not used moment.js, they are hurting themselves. This is just a really helpful library. And then for the maps we use leaflet.js. We also use Mapbox. Mostly we use Mapbox hosting for our maps and stuff like that. We don't actually use their Mapbox.js usually. HighCharts is this charting library that's actually ridiculous, but it's free for non-commercial use. So it's free for us because we're nonprofits. It's got a bazillion options. It does everything. It does way too much. But it's probably the only full-featured charting library that I had come across. There's lots of charting libraries that are really good at certain things, but not other things, and they don't always have the options to do these things. So it's a good choice for us. Then we use D3 for sort of more complex visualizations. But since we have to support older browsers, D3 is sort of a bigger investment for us because we have to create fallbacks and other ways of displaying that information for older browsers. And honestly, it depends on projects. We've used tons of other different libraries depending on what our needs are and what the application holds. A big step in what we do is taking original data from various sources and turning it into essentially JSON or some other source, some other thing. So our one-off scripts, I often use Node.js, but it really doesn't matter. I used to use Python. I still sometimes use Python if the tools are right in Python because there's some more advanced or more stable stuff there. I know PHP, but I do not ever write a one-off script in PHP. We use a Makefile for our data processing steps. So a lot of data processing is taking this random CSV, converting it into JSON, and then running it or connecting it to some other CSV, and then getting just the pieces we need so that it's proper for our application. But we also need to sort of document this, and we need to know how we get from original to JSON. And Makefile is this really old school way of managing sort of command line and dependencies. So if I turn a CSV into JSON, that's sort of one step, and then I turn that JSON, or I do some filtering on that JSON as another step. Well, that first step depends on the second one. The second one depends on the first one, and so you can write that into your Makefile. It's just a really good way to manage the process and document it as well. So yeah, so that's essentially what we're looking at. As far as like how we handle data, outside of processing it, but how do we put it into our application? If it's just a small amount of data, we put it into JSON and just embed it into our application straight up. And otherwise, if it gets a little bigger, 500 plus rows of data, we'll actually just make some JSON files and pull that in asynchronously so that the interface can load and then we can get the data. But then there's cases where we need, say, the reporters to manage some of the information in that data. And so we often use Google Spreadsheets because it has an API, a JSON API. It's really helpful. There's this thing called tabletop.js, which sort of connects to Google Spreadsheets really easily. The problem is that Google limits your request to the Google Spreadsheets, but it doesn't tell you how or why, or it'll just fail, and you're just kind of screwed. So we built some little proxies around it, and you can also create different ways to get around it if you want. But directly connecting to it for something that gets lots of traffic is asking for trouble. So we create proxies often with Heroku. We have some other services that just allow us to sort of quickly, we'll turn some JSON on Amazon into JSON-P so that we can support it for our older clients and stuff like that, and just really small one-off processes we essentially run on Heroku for free. Again, it's really about what is the cheapest option. And there's a thing called ScraperWiki, which allows you to scrape stuff. Christina's a big fan. And it allows you to scrape a website, and then it'll put it into a relational database and create an API out of that database. So it's pretty perfect for scraping sort of tasks. And then For journalists, they offer actually a premium account for free. Their free tier is 3 scrapers, which is kind of limited. But so what we did, like for the election night. So with election night, not the primaries, but like the general election, we'll get our highest traffic of the year, which may be minimal to some of you, but for us, we get 4,000 active users on the site all night long, and they're constantly requesting, data's coming in every minute. So what we'll do is stand up a server on AWS that runs and scrapes and does stuff for a couple of weeks leading up to it, and then afterwards we'll just turn it over to ScraperWiki, and we have a free API. So we also make projects every week. We're constantly making new projects, and so we want to do some things to make that a little faster. We use Yemen. I don't know what's right there. I'm going to call it Yemen, which is a templating tool. So you describe how you want your application to look from a directory file structure, and it'll spit that out for you. So what we do, and it's a command line tool, so you can say, all right, make me a MinnPost template, and then ask its name, some basic stuff. That doesn't look so good, but and we also ask, what kind of features do we want? Is it going to be a data-heavy project? Do we need Backbone? Do we need reactive? Is there going to be forms inputs? Because these are things that these are different on every project. So, and then it gets all the dependencies and creates everything for you. It saves us a whole lot of time. It adds some time because you have to maintain the generator, as they're called, but it's definitely worth it. And we've also made a front-end style guide, which is mostly CSS, SAS set of code that we can plug into every project and already have sort of our design and our components ready to go. And there it is. So it goes through a lot of things. I mean, it's got colors, obviously, colors for data visualization. Those browser notes that I was talking about, a real simple grid. It's kind of like it's like our version of Bootstrap, though I got bad feelings about Bootstrap. But essentially goes through a part, and it even goes into things like charts and stuff like that, so we can more easily make things that are visually consistent in what we do. Saves us a lot of time. And some random other stuff. For some of our browser testing, we use Browser Stack. They're not, well, they do have a free tier, but to get sort of full browser support, you've got to pay a little money, but it's fairly cheap and well worth our time instead of managing virtual machines and or physical devices, which is just not something we have time or money to do. For some load testing, for like creating APIs and other stuff like that, there's 2 things. Bees with Machine Guns, which is a Python command line thing that spins up a bunch of AWS servers and then hits your endpoint or your website with all those different servers, and so you have a much more balanced and accurate load testing. And it's free. You do spin up a bunch of AWS instances, but essentially you only do it for a half hour or however long you're load testing. So the cost is minimal. And Locust.io is another Python load testing tool that's got actually a web interface and is a little more better as far as giving you more information about your load testing, but it essentially just runs where you are running the process. So you run it locally, and running load testing locally is not a good idea. It's not really accurate. So it's got its pluses and minuses. We do everything in the open. We have like 50 plus repositories on GitHub, and maybe 3 of them are private. And the only reason they're private is because we haven't taken, it was like legacy code essentially that we just haven't taken the time to make open. And this really drives a lot about how we do things as far as documenting, commenting, and it forces you to be a little bit more thoughtful about how you build things. And overall, I think is better. One for to have conversations about the code and for the stuff that's reusable to share. But it's also just a better, kind of makes you a little better programmer, I think. So obviously our process is not perfect. We still have lots of improvements to make, and it's just a matter of finding the time to improve them. I'd really like to sort of start coding in ES6 and using the transpilers, the Google Tracer or whatever is best. I haven't actually looked at that. ES6 is sort of the next version of JavaScript, JavaScript being a really odd language where it's really just a spec. And most browsers don't support a lot of this stuff, but you can write it in ES6 and compile it to ES5, which is currently the supported version. So it kind of allows you to look into the future a little bit. With that, it kind of requires us, since we'll add another compile step, we should look at using Gulp, which is sort of similar to Grunt. Instead of configuration, it's more a scripting sort of approach, more stream-based, and it's a lot faster than Grunt. So we'd really like to push Gulp to doing our compile step, like Sass compiling, but still use Grunt for some of our task stuff as well, because it's a little more appropriate in my opinion. With that, we should start using source maps a little better and not really, since we wouldn't be developing without compiling, which is currently what we're doing, we'd have to start using source maps to be able to debug accurately. We don't write any tests. We are kind of worthless in this realm. I'd like to think it's because we work fast and small projects, blah blah blah. No, it's just a matter of bad practices. But I'd really like to be better about this. It'd be really nice to sort of plug the custom Google Analytics events into what we do, because we don't really have any insight into how people use our apps. And so putting this into our template would be really cool. TrackJS, which is a local company, it does error reporting. I'm not going to be able to describe this in a couple words. So if someone comes to your site and they get an error from your JavaScript, TrackJS catches that error, logs it on their machines, and you can it'll tell you later, right? So you can know if, say, some odd browser or just some user is getting some errors, and you can start to debug other people's machines more easily. Because right now, if someone says like, "Oh, this doesn't work," well, we can start to ask them what browser they're using. But if they're using a browser that we look at and can't actually see any errors, or we have really nothing to go on. And so this would be a good sort of proactive step in making sure that we can support things better. I don't currently have live reload browser sync installed, and this what this is just if you save a JavaScript file, a little process will tell the browser that, hey, that JavaScript file has changed, so reload that. You don't have to go to the page and hit refresh, which is, I don't know, my hands are kind of used to it, so I don't know how to change that. But this does it automatically. Browser sync looks pretty cool. It's kind of a newer tool that hooks up to things, and you can run that with your sort of general Grunt task stuff. So that's all I got. I'm happy to hear what other people do and don't do, or think of what we do, because I know it's not perfect. I know it's kind of just what we have time to put together and what I actually find is good practices, but I'm just one person, so.
many folks do you have at MinnPost on design? Is it just you?
For our interactive stuff, it's
Yeah.
it's me and two half people, and I'm the only really programmer. So when I say we win all this technical stuff, it's essentially me.
Yeah.
But we have like Katie does a lot of design, mocking up sort of stuff and stuff like that, and so
IEA decision, who makes that in your organization?
It's-
You're a nonprofit, so it doesn't really impact revenue.
yes and no. I mean, it's hard to say. We don't really know who the IAAs users are. More than likely, they're people at large organizations that don't have control over their browsers. But that doesn't mean they aren't people giving us money. But I don't know. We also, we have a fair amount of older audience, and our assumption is that they don't actually look at the interactive stuff all that much either. So we don't really know. We just know we have a fair amount. We don't fully support it, but we try to. When I started, we were trying to do IE7, and eventually I was like, look, we don't. This is just harder than it's worth, And at one point, hopefully soon. I mean, it's kind of dwindling all the time. So.
We support it at 4%. So.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, we support it at 5%.
Yeah. I mean, for us, we don't own a big site. It's probably the biggest site I've worked on myself. But 5% is a fair amount of people. So.
Does the high chart stuff more than 98%?
Yeah, it's totally cross-browser. Like it's a monster of a library. It'll do everything.
Is that based on REST or is it just its own?
I think it's its own. Yeah, it'll do the VML, like all the cross-browser drawing stuff. Yeah. I don't necessarily suggest it. I think it's really good for our use case, but.
How, like, city of Minneapolis, like, you guys have done some stuff in the city of Minneapolis. How are you accessing that data? Do they have endpoints that they publish that, or scraping?
No, I mean overall, there's not. The Minneapolis, city of Minneapolis doesn't really have any APIs. We just sort of requested data from them before in the past. They recently just passed an open data law, which will create a data portal, which depending on what they use could mean an API, it could mean downloads. It's kind of hard to say, but there's a few agencies on the state level that have APIs, but we don't try not to. It's hard for us, it's hard to depend on APIs that are not ours, right? Because we need things to be standing. And so with the Secretary of State, they don't have an API. They just have these flat CSV sort of files that we parse and then turn into an API ourselves. But we still have to read them every 5 minutes on election night. So.
When you create those scripts to do data parsing, switching CSV or converting CSV into JSON, like that, right? Those usually things that you just do kind of one-off to get the data, or are they reusable?
Yeah. I mean, for us, for like the data processing stuff I was talking about, that's one-off processes. Like.
But you still document it.
Yeah. It's totally. It's like there's two main things. One, it's repeatable in case we have to come back to it. Like there's things that we build that, like the election dashboard, we have to do every year or multiple times a year, and so we need it to be repeatable to some degree. And two, transparency's sake, as a news organization, we want to make sure that we can say this is how we got from the original data to the other data. But yeah, it's hardly ever that reusable.
Have you looked at or Fox Media?
Yeah, that's their CMS. Yeah. So Vox Media, they're kind of a newer-ish organization, but they started with a very large goal to be very tech savvy, and they are. And so their CMS is really, they've got a bunch of smart people working on it, and they are constantly updating it. It's really designed to be really friendly for people to build things and template out things and stuff like that. I've never actually seen it. They don't open it up, but I've talked to some people that have worked on it. So.
you guys looked at Commodify as far as API generators. I don't know how big it is, but I've used it for hobby projects, and they seem pretty friendly to all API generators as far as like scraping the APIs.
Oh yeah.
We were considering. I haven't seen ScraperWiki.
So it's like a hosted service where you put your data, or Yeah.
They give you basically like point and click API.
Okay.
generators. It's pretty neat.
Yeah. Huh.
From somebody who's done PHP.
Yeah. Scraper. I mean, I can't talk about ScraperWiki without laughing because of you. ScraperWiki's, it's not perfect, but you can code in almost anything you want. You know, like.
Scraping's never perfect.
Yeah, right. And so, but it'll tell you, you know, if your scraper is broken, and the API will still be there even if it breaks, you know, that sort of thing. So it's pretty helpful.
Also, thank you for RequireJS.
Yeah, it's actually pretty new. It's just some local guys just started it recently. I haven't set it up. I've been meaning to. But it's like, yeah, we need to know about this stuff, right? So. All right. Well, I'll end it there. Thanks a lot.